First of all, I just want to thank you for doing this. You've been a district superintendent in the Twin Cities district for, is this your 8th year?
Yeah, starting my 8th year and 8th and final. There's a term limit on this gig.
Yeah. And then prior to that, you were the director of congregational development. Is that correct? Is that the right title?
Yeah, for 4 years. So I had responsibility for our church revitalization efforts and also new church starts across the state. And if you remember Reach, Renew, Rejoice, that was a part of my role too, to be able to garner some resources to accomplish what I was charged with. And before that, I had 30 years in local churches, just like you've been serving, Paul.
Right, and even planted a church yourself, correct?
Yes, out in Maple Grove. So Crosswinds started in homes, and then a movie theater, and then our moved to that location where people are familiar with it now. Off of Weaver Lake Road in 94.
Yeah. So you, with all of that, over the last decade and a half you've been intimately involved just in churches in the Minnesota Conference, church revitalization as a district superintendent and as the director of congregational development. But really, you've been working in just all kinds of areas around revitalization, church planting, church growth, all of that in this conference for the better part of a few decades. What do you think the church needs to change in our coming decades as you kind of are coming to the end of a career here, or at least as a district superintendent and all you've done over the last few decades? What do you think the big things are that the church needs to look at in terms of change today and going forward?
Well, I think in some of your subsequent questions, we'll probably get into a little bit more detail. But I'd like to respond first to your question about how or what does the church need to change by asking the question, why does the church need to change? And so let me tell you a little story. My daughter, Becky, right now, she's a social worker and is in the midst of launching a nonprofit called the Seed Club. It's Sharing Empathy Every Day is the name of it. In fact, she's met with, she's got it's a nonprofit incorporation now. She's meeting with a web designer today as we speak, planning to launch it on November 28th, which would have been the 16th birthday for my granddaughter, Lauren, her daughter, who tragically, died of epilepsy complications a couple of years ago now, and it's kind of meaning making for Becky. But this organization is designed to be a crowdsourced social enterprise that meets people where they're at and kind of nurtures them to share their gifts for the purpose of an impact on the world. Now, it sounds curiously like making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, isn't it, Paul?
Yes.
But here's somebody, my daughter, who was immersed in the local church growing up, no longer sees the institutional church as a place to really make a difference in the world. So she's launching this social enterprise of her own. So, and I celebrate it, I applaud it, but it also has caused me to reflect a lot lately that if we're going to fully embrace our vision of growing in love of God and neighbor, reaching new people and healing a broken world, maybe for these new generations of people, we have to rediscover, we have to claim, and we have to communicate our why so that new generations of folks can really see the church is still a vital a value add to their life and to the world. And so maybe our how, when you ask me the question, how and why how and what does the church need to change? I think we need to change by focusing on our why first.
Yeah, and I'll say I love that that your daughter is doing this, and some might grieve that, like, oh, why not go into ministry? Why not be a pastor? But it does speak to the way in which it's sort of sad, and we have something to figure out in regards to why people are turning away from the church, but there is still a yearning inside of people to do good work in the world and
to be spiritually engaged and to be relationally connected. Yeah, yep. And as we make impact in the world. And so that's there. And so I think our hope for the future is is finding ways for the church to do that again, all the more. But some obstacles get in our way.
Well, and that leads to my next question, because I was going to say, I think every church wants to be relevant and meaningful in the world for the common good. I think especially in the Twin Cities district, you're looking at a lot of churches that probably want to be engaged in social justice, that want to be doing all the right and good things. So what's stopping us? What's getting in the way? What are the big stumbling blocks for the churches that you see in and around your sphere?
Well, Paul, when after 30 years in the local church ministry, before coming into this more kind of judicatory kind of role, I thought I'd sort of seen everything and wouldn't be surprised by much. But I may have shared this story with you previously, but two things surprised me coming into this role, and a third just most recently. And that's that the obstacles, I think that some of the biggest obstacles for the church are that would trip over ourselves, not obstacles that the world puts in front of us. I mean, those have always been present, but it's tripping over ourselves. And one is this whole idea of personal preference trumping missional purpose, where just individuals' needs or traditions in their local church, albeit good, maybe well-intentioned and certainly started out of an important need, that becomes repetitive, and we fail to look at what is the real missional purpose of some of the things that we're doing as church. There's a personal preference trumping that missional purpose. Another is high tolerance for bad behavior. I see it. That's another obstacle I see us tripping over with just writing off just bad behavior in the local church that you wouldn't tolerate in any other business setting or other nonprofit setting, but because we're somehow a grace-filled faith community, we don't kind of call people on some of this stuff, and that's been an obstacle that we trip over. And the most recent one that has also kind of surprised me, and if I'm honest, kind of irritates me, is a recent movement toward doctrinal purity. So in the name of theological integrity, there's a movement toward theological conformity. And you'll see that coming out in the midst of our schism that we find ourselves currently in as the United Methodist Church. I see this as another real obstacle for us, that we're somehow justifying our schism by needing to more narrowly define our theological posture. If purity somehow really led to health and reproduction, that's not my understanding of organisms. Genetic diversity is what brings health and reproduction to organisms. And so it caused me, so I've thought back just to my own personal experience about all this. So for 3 decades, it was kind of an interesting little thing. Maybe it's just because I'm getting near retirement, but I think I'd estimate that I'm hitting right around 5,000 deep faith life conversations that I've had across my 42 plus years of ministry, and all focused on Christ and Christian community. But I'd have to say I can't remember a single one of those 5,000 that were somehow, where people were somehow concerned about the physical details of things like virgin birth, bodily resurrection, the gender of God, all these things that we want theological conformity on. Not one of those 5,000 conversations related to that. What they were related to were things like, how is God continually creating? What does it look like to be a Jesus follower? Or how do I connect more deeply with the power of this Holy Spirit that you talk about? Those things, yeah, all the time. People wanted to know things like, how does this Christian faith thing help me with forgiveness and reconciliation and wholeness in my life? When you talk about incarnation, where is God really present in our world today? Or when you say the word resurrection, how is there new life for me? And how can I be born again and again and again and again to see life in new and fresh ways? Those were the conversations I had like 5,000 times over, never once about with the right singular belief or doctrine. So I just want to throw that out. I think that also is a tripping point for our church today.
Then, of course, though, there was also this thing in 2020 called COVID, and intersecting with some social justice, renewal and action around that. And of course, there were things, in that period of time that certainly impacted us in the church, at least temporarily, but many, myself included, believe that there have been some kind of permanent changes that have come out of that year. I'm wondering if you agree with that, and how you've seen COVID change churches and the church in a more permanent, or at least somewhat long-term way.
Well, as you're aware, we're still living into this. We don't really know what post-COVID looks like, or if there will be such a thing as post-COVID. But so for the COVID response, I think in most of our churches, some kind of response initially was required just to survive. Mm-hmm. Those that didn't want change at all, they are not surviving. In fact, we're closing some churches. But I think the things that were necessary to survive may now be some of our foundation to thrive going forward. So one is some kind of nimble governance and responsive decision making, so that you don't have to wait around for months to get a series of committees to be all aligned on the same thing. There's somehow a way to more nimbly respond to needs at hand. So, and kind of along with that, pragmatic programming, so that what we do isn't just because we've always done it before, but asking the question constantly, does it work? So during COVID, churches were the ones that came through this well were constantly evaluating and then pivoting and then trying something new. Maybe it's not perfect, but they were just, they weren't stuck. They were willing to have a culture of experimentation, sort of. A culture that focused not on how do we perfect this and polish it and do things so very right, but just what's the next right direction. And I think that's critical. And another is layered communication systems. For a long time, some of our large churches relied on the 1 hour of Sunday worship and the half hour of coffee time afterwards to make kind of everything happen in the life of the church. That's where the synergy was for communications, connections, idea sharing, people feeling they belonged, all that, kind of all sandwiched in. But those that relied on that, and in fact, we had some churches that went for months before they even experimented with other ways to communicate and connect, and they really started to falter. But those that jumped in and embraced social media, phone chains, multiple worship platforms, Zoom, small groups and meetings, on-demand discipleship, all these different kinds of things. So this layered communications, that's what created it more, seeing it more as a network rather than the church geographically at the center of the wheel with all the spokes going out. There's more of a network kind of communication system. Another is real practical diversification of revenue streams. There are a lot of churches relied still, on the Sunday morning offering plate, literally as a primary source of revenue. And then churches started to realize, gee, we gotta get stepped up here on just online giving. There was a payment protection, program that helped churches realize, we can have to keep our eyes open to outside grants, maybe on going forward too, that are going to support ministries of the church, foundations, community partnerships. So just diversification of revenue streams and not relying on the Sunday morning offering plate, one key thing. And a last one that we're now beginning to see, because we were really high tech for a long time, because that was really our only option to kind of do church. We're seeing a return to high tech and high touch. So that's we're not going to lose that piece. So the high tech is still how we do church, but high touch is how we be church. That's people are still needing somehow avenues to feel personally engaged and seen.
Mm.
seeing people and their hurts and their struggles and frustrations and their joys and victories are celebrated somehow within faith community together.
So in terms of like, because, all of this is about how do we succeed? It's not just how do we survive, but that's part of it. But how do we succeed? How do we become a vibrant, relevant community or a presence in our communities? What type of models, if you can even say it that way, do you see bearing fruit today? And maybe what are some models that just aren't?
So just a few things that I'm seeing and hearing. Like the East Side Ministry, where that used to be Silver Lake United Methodist Church with a geographic location in Oakdale, sold their building, and they are now really a building-free entity, not unlike Aldersgate in this moment right now too. I know a building may be on your horizon again in some way, but what's interesting to see here is maybe it's the depth of their small group ministry that's now unfolding when their time doesn't have to be spent on maintaining the building and income reports, being draining at every single council meeting. They're now their contributions pretty much with very low overhead. The value of the building is kind of invested for pastoral support kind of stuff, and they're actually drawing. They're more or less making it on the interest draws on the value of their building to support a 3/4 time pastor plus maybe about half of the contributions from the small groups, and then the other half of the contributions from the small groups go into direct ministry in their community because there's no other overhead. So I'm seeing that as bearing fruit in terms of what does sustainable ministry look like when you can remove a lot of the trappings of overhead and administration. And then when I've met with they have a couple of small groups now. It's not exponential visible growth, like huge numbers of people, although they've doubled, they've gone from 1 to 2 small groups. Right. And from about, 10 to 20 people actively engaged in the ministry. But they would say they have had the most deeply rooted faith experience in their whole Christian lives because of the way that they can do church in a small group model rather than in more of a passive observational spectator sport model that the church was previously based on. So that's one thing that I think is worth watching, and I think is going to bear fruit. And how do we learn from that building free small group kind of ministry model church? Survival mergers are not working. You asked what's not working. So when we're just combining resources together and then leaving one of the 2 mission fields entirely to just lump the existing people into the next one. Also, this whole notion, it's a kind of a theological thing these days of entrenchment where, saying the church and God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that we ought to just do church the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and that it's a sellout to the to popular opinion and to the popular social milieu to do anything new. Well, those that aren't changing somehow are also losing their relevance.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, just even listening to that, you can see the way in which the canvas is just sort of a blank slate right now in terms of what might work and what might not work, which leads to that other question of what does it even mean to be fruitful? What do you see as a fruitful ministry or fruitful church these days? How do you even define it? What does that look like?
You sent me these questions a week or 2 ago, and this particular one we've been wrestling with as an appointive cabinet and an extended cabinet in terms of the leadership for the last year solidly, in part because we've also been hearing from many of you as leaders in local churches. What are the right things to measure these days, and how do we measure in a way that so what you pay attention to is oftentimes what you get, and how do you pay attention to the right things? so that it helps to lead to fruitfulness, rather than sometimes the things that we're measuring right now almost lead to shame and despair, because some of these things we're not going to measure up now in any way to things that we did previously. So for instance, there was if you go back into the 60s, 70s, maybe even early 80s, there was this notion, if you build it, they will come. So one metric was build a nice facility and then you'll grow. And the nicer the facility, the more you grow. And then we measured membership for a long time, as if somehow the people on the rolls were a sign of whether you're fruitful. And then we switched to average worship attendance on Sundays, as if that was the best sign of participation and growth. Well, now, if our mission is really making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, we're really questioning if measuring the number of butts in a pew on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. in a particular geographic location is the best way to measure whether we're making disciples of Jesus Christ and whether the world is getting transformed at all. So it's probably a little bit. So I just have to confess this. I'm still thinking this through myself personally, seeking input from lots of others, but it probably has more with how do we measure engagement and how do we measure impact? So how do we engagement, meaning it could be spiritually and relationally somehow, and impact, and how is our neighborhoods and community somehow being changed?
It is hard that question is hard. So I asked it, what does it even mean to be a fruitful congregation today is a difficult question. And so, and this is what keeps me up at night. How can the church, and I mean both the church kind of broadly big picture, but also an individual congregation, how can it be a relevant entity around social justice while remaining the church and not merely becoming an arm of a political party or movement? What are your views on that? I'm not asking you as though you have the magic answer, but I'm just curious how you see that playing out.
I think so. I've been pondering this a lot myself. I think where I'm at right now, Paul, is I think it maybe lies somewhere in holding a healthy tension between our four stated Minnesota Annual Conference values. That's where I'm kind of playing with this, maybe as a communication piece to some of our churches this fall. So when you think of our four key values are grounded in Wesleyan theology, rooted in Jesus, inclusive of all persons, and engaged in the work of justice and reconciliation. It's not any one of those. It's holding those four fully in tension with one another. Can you see this? I just scribbled this out this morning because I know I was going to be talking to you and you'd ask me some questions similar to this. So those are the four values there. And there's a vertical dimension, that's kind of spiritual, grounded in Wesleyan theology, kind of a head thing at the top, and then rooted in Jesus, also being the spiritual vertical dimension, kind of a heart thing. And then you see a horizontal dimension that's more, this world oriented, inclusive of all persons. Think of that maybe as embracing each other's open arms and hands, and then engage in the work of justice and reconciliation. Say that's putting our feet to the pavement and really making a difference in the world. And not that these are quadrants in any way, but because I'm still playing with this. And it's not like any one of these are right or wrong. It's that we need all of them. And when we get stuck in just one quadrant or another, that's when we lose relevance. And that's when we also become nothing more than a singular political party or ideology. But sort of think of this cross kind of thing maybe as rubber bands. I'm still trying to play with this metaphor, and I welcome other people's thoughts and ideas too. The idea, if we're not stretching those, the rubber bands are just loose and really not anything. But when you pull in each direction, then at the very center, there's energy. There's the ability to propel something forward. And it's all of those dimensions of our core values in the Minnesota Conference working together.
But I appreciate that image you just drew out there, because it really works well with that general rule of discipleship image that we've been really working with at Aldersgate. So then, speaking of Aldersgate, just knowing where we are now and what we've come through, and if you just had like a little bit of some words for us, a charge, an encouragement, what's on your heart for Aldersgate these days?
Well, it was a privilege for me to be with you at your kind of closing decommissioning service for the building. Because I sensed both I sensed the historic nature of for the congregation tied to that community, and at the same time, just although it doesn't come without a significant emotion, a willingness for the gospel and for the sake of relevance and for the sake of sustainable ministry for the future, to be willing to take a risk to try something different. And I just want to thank all of you for being really a research and development arm for the Minnesota Conference. So one, I pray for you as I just celebrate the fact, what is this now, about 2 months working with Spirit of Christ Lutheran in shared facility. So pretty new, but I look forward to and pray for that being a fruitful kind of union of your work and witness together and experimentation on what a shared facility look like. It may be temporary, it may be long term. I think we don't exactly know yet, but I'm willing to walk with you at least for the balance of my tenure toward that end. And then what you discover there may inform others. You are helping us discover and ask the right questions and maybe even find some of the answers. And what can ministry look like when we're unfettered from at least church buildings as we've known it? That's really important for me. And I applaud you for that. What does faith community look like when you're reminded once again that the church is not a building, but the church is a people? I mean, we sing it, we say it, but do we really live that out? A last thing that I'd share, it interestingly came to me just literally 5 minutes before we started this video call, Paul. My wife and Deb and my grandson, one of my grandsons, Henry, went to farmer's market 2 weeks ago in Maple Grove, and they got one of these monarch butterfly kits. It's just a little cup thing with a cover on it with a larva in it and some milkweed leaves, and so it sat in there, watched the little caterpillar eating the milkweed leaves, and then it transitioned to a kind of a J shape, then built the chrysalis around it, and then it's been sitting closed up for a good 10 days since then. This happened this morning. It happened after I left. But can you see that?
Yep.
It emerged this morning after I left the house, but Deb sent me that picture. And it was just a touching reminder to me, God is in the transformation business. I mean, the very creation witnesses this all around us every single day. And my prayer for Aldersgate Methodist Church is that you too would be transformed by these steps in ministry. You'd be supported by a God that didn't just create, but is creating and creating and creating anew every single day. And that we can't even, just like this transformation of this larva into this beautiful butterfly that it's supposed to sit for 6 hours in the cup before you let it go. The wings have to dry out, so I'll be able to be part of the setting free of the monarch. It may not be during my tenure, friends, but I hope that I can be part of a witness to be setting free of Aldersgate United Methodist Church into whatever it is in the future that God is calling you to be.